You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Hey folks, good evening. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You can find all the different outlets where this show plays. And also, you can join my YouTube channel, where we are showing the simulcast of this broadcast in video. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can join the live chat room there. Join in the conversation tonight and get to be part of the Intrepid family. Now, tonight, I've got kind of a special treat, at least it is for me. You know my love for history. I love history. I love ancient history. I love Renaissance history. But one of my favorite periods of history is colonial America and the French and Indian War to the Revolutionary War. That's always been an intriguing part of history for me. And I picked up this Smithsonian magazine, and I've got it here. And if you can see this, if you're looking on in video, it's got a great article in it. Young George Washington started a war. And so I want to take a look at this because I was really intrigued by this. You know, French and Indian War. How many of you are familiar with the French and Indian War? It was known in its time as the 7 Years' War because it lasted 7 years. And it really wasn't between the French and the Indians. It was really between the French and the British vying over territory here in colonial America. And the colonists at this time were loyalists to the crown, loyal to King George II. And they were fighting against the French. Well, they hadn't really started fighting yet. They were vying with them. There was a lot of diplomatic talk going back and forth. And the Indian tribes, primarily the Seven Nations, the Huron, the Iroquois, the Shawnee, I'm trying to think of all the tribes off the top of my head, and it's not coming to me. But these were the tribes that allied with one side or the other at the time. And at the time of the French and Indian War, it started in 1754, and it went to 1761, I believe. It was 7 years. And so this war lasted. But there was always a little controversy as to how the first shot was fired, so to speak. How did this thing kick off from tense relations going on between the British and the French over territory? And now, mind you, this is about 25 years prior to the American Revolution. And so how did this thing start? And there was some very interesting new information that was recently discovered by the author of the article in the Smithsonian magazine. And so I want to dig into this a little bit tonight and hopefully give you some very interesting history about the United States before it was the United States. We're talking Britain and France vying for territory here. And of course, we kind of all know who won in the long run. But the big question is, when did it really start? And how did it start? I had heard stories. I read a book called The Crucible of War. And in that book, many years ago, and it stated that George Washington was part of a contingent, a diplomatic contingent, that ended with, after he left, the Indians took their violence out on the French. They sliced open the commander's head and washed their hands in his brains. And now Washington had kind of left that scene, leaving it be a thing where, well, you know, the Indians said, why are you letting these guys live? And Washington kind of turned a blind eye to it. Well, there's more information now, and I think you'll find this very interesting. Here is George Washington. Now, those of you who, by the way, who are not United States citizens, I've got a lot of you out there in Europe, in Great Britain, in Australia, and New Zealand, and different places. I think this will be a fun study for you to follow, but this is colonial times in America, and we're talking primarily about a just discovered eyewitness account that provides this startling new evidence about who fired the first shot that sparked the French and Indian War, which, by the way, folks, was actually really the First World War. Every nation was involved in this war or had some stake in it. And so let's look at this history here. On the night of May 27th, 1754, it was George Washington, the guy who became known as the father of our country, the United States. He's on the $1 bill. His face is seen almost every day by almost every citizen in this country. But many people don't know much about his history other than that he was the first president of the United States of America. Now, George Washington, we're talking 23 years prior to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the 4th of July and all of that. Washington led a party of Virginia soldiers out of an encampment in the Ohio Valley. And the conditions were really pretty horrid. The night, as was reported in his journals, was pitch black. This is what George Washington recorded in his own journal. It was an unceasing rain that made the dark woods even more impervious to the soldiers and the warriors. Now, keep in mind, when you live in America, we think, oh, the Ohio Valley, I know where that is, and I know where all that... Well, of course, there was not much there yet. It was all wilderness, other than the native tribes who dwelt there. And Washington was only 22 years old, and his mouth was probably still full of his own teeth at that point. The uniform he wore was likely a woolen officer's coat, showing his allegiance to the British Empire. He was a loyal subject of King George II, and he and his Virginia regiment of a little over 100 effective soldiers were the tip of His Majesty's spear in North America. And their assignment? To finish building a fort that would anchor Britain's control over the Ohio Valley. But as Washington and his men marched westward over the Appalachian Mountains, they received stunning news. The French had already captured their intended destination, known as Trent's Fort, and hundreds of French troops had aimed over a dozen cannons at the British soldiers stationed there and forced their surrender. So this is a place in the Ohio Valley. It was really in the Pennsylvania, the colony of Pennsylvania. And so by May 24th, Washington had encamped at the Great Meadows. And that's with a capital G and a capital M. The Great Meadows. It was a known place. One of the few open clearings amid the dark Appalachian woods at the time. And there he received word from a man named Tanegrisson. He was an Ohio Iroquois, that an army of French soldiers was coming to attack his men. French tracks were spotted only 5 miles up from the camp, and Washington sent out 75 of his best soldiers to search for the French party. Then his Indian allies found the spot where the French were camping. They were hidden in a glen near the crest of a mountain range. And on May 27th, the men who remained with Washington, a small party of about 40 British soldiers. I remember I said there were about 100 effective soldiers. He had about 100 good soldiers, and the rest were tag-alongs and farmers and colonials and so on. And so a small party of about 40 British soldiers remained with Washington, and perhaps 7 or 8 Ohio Iroquois allies. And they marched 5 miles, and they climbed 700 feet up the steep eastern face of Chestnut Ridge, which is, of course, still there today. It's a geographical landmark that you can go visit. Now, 7 soldiers got lost as they stumbled in the rain over the ridge lines, many rocks, spurs, draws, and by the time the remaining 33 men crested the ridge, They were exhausted and thoroughly soaked by the rain. And as the sun began to rise, the soldiers struggled to operate their muskets amid lingering dampness. And it was around 7 a.m. on May 28th when the Virginians, advancing in a single file, came up to the rocky precipice overlooking the French camp, and Washington was at the head of the column and the first to spot the French, who, he later reported, scrambled for their muskets. And the battle that ensued now between the British and the French, British under the command of Washington, lasted a whole 15 minutes. And at least 10 French soldiers fell. Most of them were killed by Washington's Indian allies, and one of those dead Frenchmen was the party's commander, Ensign Joseph Calhoun de Villers de Jumonville. And the mountain glen was a macabre scene of unburied and scalped French corpses, with a Frenchman's decapitated head stuck on a pole. Now, historians have long identified this skirmish in the woods as the spark that ignited the French and Indian War. But there's an untold dimension to this story, a little more depth to it, and of course, as we know, a little more history. When you can uncover little tidbits of history that illuminate the history we think we already know, to me, that's absolutely fascinating. And so there's this untold dimension. And several years ago, digging through colonial papers in the British National Archives, was discovered evidence that was previously unreported. And it suggests that the man who would become America's first president might have been more complicated a leader and more culpable for starting a 7-year-long global war than history has led us to believe up to this point. And so the French and Indian War, it's one of those conflicts that we learned about in history classes, but tend to be really hazy on the details. Now, if you ever saw the movie The Patriot, Mel Gibson's movie, you would see a story that unfolds about a real guy, and the character in the movie was kind of an amalgam of a couple of different colonials, but he fought many years earlier in the French and Indian War. And so you've seen elements of this war depicted in the movies, not very often, and you may have learned about it in class if you were, here in the United States and you learn, but that's partly because it all took place a generation before the Revolutionary War. That's why it's hazy. That's why there's not a lot of information. And it's a time when most Americans don't really think that much about. It's before we were a country. It's while we were still a colony. And it also became the name that is a bit confusing. It was a conflict between British and French colonists, with Indian nations as allies on both sides of that conflict. But back then, the colonists on the Atlantic seaboard were still loyal to Britain. French influence extended far inland. I mean, if you're talking the Ohio Valley, you're going almost to the midsection of this continent. And it was starting to expand into the Ohio Valley, edging into Pennsylvania. And, well, you're kind of in the Middle East of the United States there. And the British had more people and resources, but the French had access to all the important waterways, and they kind of controlled them, including the Great Lakes and the Mississippi. And as French philosopher Voltaire wrote about the time of the Jumonville affair, he said, "So complicated are the political interests of the present times that a shot fired in America shall be the signal for setting all Europe together by the ears." And this is really very true, and this is what happened. When I said it really comprised what ended up being tantamount to the First World War, this is awfully accurate. Now, I want to show you a couple of pictures. Now, if you're listening on radio, you're not going to be able to see these. Sorry. So I'll give you some verbal descriptions of these. And anytime you want, you can come back and find this show archived if you're not over in the in the YouTube chat room right now, and you can see some of these pictures if you're interested in this history. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is, let me back up a little bit here and say, I was part of a military living history reenactment group. What we did was we reenacted a company of men that were part of the 42nd Royal Highlanders during the French and Indian War. They became known as, they were known as the Black Watch, and that regiment still exists in the British Army today. And so they were Scots, Highland Scots, that were fighting for the British king. And this isn't long after the clan system had been torn apart. Remember the whole affair with Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Battle of Culloden Moor, and the clan system was dismantled. But the king at the time said, you know, he probably spoke with a German accent, he was German George, but he wanted all these regiments. He said, what a waste of men. Let's let them have a sort of semblance of their clan governance by bringing in the clan leaders and allowing them to form the regiments, the Scottish regiments in the British Army. And that's kind of a very light overview of that. And this is how the 42nd, or the Black Watch, became known as the 42nd. And so we did some reenacting. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here that were kind of fun. We formed our own little troop of about 20 guys that represented a company of the 42nd Royal Highlanders during the French and Indian War. And it was it was the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga where they first got their commission from the king as a royal regiment. And so let me see, I got a couple of pictures here first. I want to show you something. Well, first thing I want to do is show you, this is an image of a painting of George Washington. This is Washington at the time. He was about 22 years old, and he was a commander. And here it shows him in a blue coat, but he would have worn probably the opposite of this, a red coat with blue facings. And when he raised the colonial armies against Great Britain, he reversed that. It was blue coats with generally red facings. But here you've got, this is Washington. Now, remember how I said the conflict extended up the rivers and into the heartland of what would become the United States of America? Do you know it reached as far as right here, almost where I'm sitting? I am in Wisconsin, and not far from here, a few miles south, is the Mississippi River, which divides Wisconsin from Minnesota at certain parts in the south. And that river has a lake that's called Lake Pepin, and it's really just a wider expanse of the river. It's at a place called Maiden Rock. There's a couple of little towns on the Wisconsin side and also on the Minnesota side, but the river just widens into a lake and narrows back down again. Well, on this lake was a fort that was built in the late 1600s, and that fort also served as a French fort during the French and Indian War. Now, I don't know of many battles or anything like that made it this far, but there was a fort. Let me show you a picture. This is Lake Pepin, not far from where I live in Wisconsin. There you go. And that's the Mississippi pouring into Lake Pepin. And you can see the bluffs on the other side of the river. And down below the bluffs is where you would find Fort Saint Antoine. I was going to say Antonio. Saint Antoine was the fort, and it was a fur trader's fort that later became a French fort. And so that shows you, even during the French and Indian War, this is how far inland these different sides had come. And so now the fort is not there anymore, and there's nothing left of the fort, but there's a historical marker off the main road that runs along the river there between all the little towns. And so now I mentioned, and this is just for fun, I'm going to show you this. This is our little regiment that we put together right here. It was called the 42nd Royal Highlanders. And if you look on the left there, for those of you who can't see, sorry about that, I'm in all of these pictures, but the picture to the far left and the one right next to it, these were the uniforms we put together, and we were kind of stitch Nazis. Everything we did was to be as accurate as we could to the patterns of the day, the colors of the day, and so on. And now we started off using a scarlet, which was really reserved for officers. And we later made different coats that were made of madder red. It was crushed from the roots, the madder root, and it gave it more of a brick red. But here you go, where I'm in the Black Watch kilt, the 42nd Royal Highlanders. And this is the Royal Regiment. You see the blue facings on my collar and on my cuffs. They were buff originally, and when they were given the writ from the king and became a royal regiment, then they changed them out to the navy blue, or the royal blue. You can see the socks on the far right, or hose. This was a pattern that was found in the ground at Fort Ticonderoga. And this is what the Scots wore as leggings, and they tied them up with the facings. And we did school days and things like that with our group. In the upper right, you see me acting as a sergeant and getting all the kids in order, and we took them through our camp. And down below on the lower right is the full regiment and all the tents and so on. And there was actually one other picture I wanted to show you. This is a really rough picture. It's a bad picture. I'm going to call it up right now. You can see how blurry it is. I could not find the original on this, but this is at Fort Ticonderoga. We're right in the middle of this shot, and I believe almost right in the middle, that's me in the red coat with my back to you. And this is our regiment with several other regiments where we recreated the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga way back in 2001. Is when this picture was taken. And there were about 800 French soldiers and about 1,200 British soldiers, all different regiments, and we had about 200 to 250 Native Americans, or actors portraying Native Americans, for both sides. And we were down on the flats below the fort, Ticonderoga, reenacting the battles, cannon, musket fire, so on, and it was amazing, an amazing time. But that is my little experience with the French and Indian War. And I'm going to show you a couple of other pictures. I talked about the Indian chief who informed to Washington. And this is him here. The French called him Half King. And his name, it's so hard to say. I got to go back and look where I have this written down here. If I could remember it, I'd just say it off the top of my head. Let's see where he is. There he is. Tenengrisson. He was Washington's Iroquois ally. And according to one French officer, he was formally inclined to the French before turning to help the Virginians. And so this is a sculpture of him here. So let me get back here, and I'm going to turn his picture off. And then I mentioned that there was a fort. And this is the fort right here that is in the Ohio Valley. And this was renamed Fort Necessity. And it's a tiny little fort. This is a reconstruction of it. And this is where Washington's men would have been holed up. And they marched from here and went up into this place right here. If you see at the bottom of the picture, to the left and the right and down at the very bottom, these are the rocks. This is what's known today as Washington's Rocks. When they came up over the ridge to attack the French, surprise the French camp would have been right out there in what looks like the clearing there, with the path going off in it. And this is where the battle took place. And Washington's men came out of the rocks here. And let's see, I've got, I think, one more shot of this, if I'm not mistaken. The rocks, there they are. Nope, that wasn't it. Okay, so Washington's Rocks, I thought I had them in here. It was a different shot from the other angle, and I don't think I got it put in here. I've got Pepin, Fort Necessity, so on and so forth. The rocks here. I'll turn this one on. This is a sketch from the day, the death of Jumonville, and you see Washington is in the upper center of this illustration. He's looking back toward his troops, and they're opening fire on the French. And so this is what took place. And so I'm going to turn that one off. So let's get back into the information here. There's just a couple of pictures for color. I thought that would be a little fun for you to see. Now, at the time, the Indians in the Ohio Valley were still pretty independent, and they were actually very powerful at this point, the Seven Nations. And both sides needed the Indians as military and trading partners. And the French, I want to make sure I didn't just run over time here, and I think I may have. Let's see. Yeah, I think I did. So, folks, I got to stop there for a second. We got to cut out to break, and then I'll be right back. So you sit tight for a couple of minutes. Hang on. We'll be right back. Hey folks, we're back. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for sitting through the break for this amazing history lesson. Don't look at it as a lesson. Look at it as fun history. This is something that will enrich you a bit. And it's very interesting stuff if you've never known the history of this period. And so, this is Scotty Roberts, by the way. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com. And come on over, join the live chat room. Take a look at the simulcast in video on my YouTube stream, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we were talking about this lead up to all this new interesting information about George Washington, very possibly being the catalyst to launching the French and Indian War. Now, it's not that it wasn't already building up to that point, but there's something he did that really triggered it and really pissed off the French. And so we're building up to that point. Now, at this time, I started talking about the Indians in the Ohio Valley from the Seven Nations were still independent. They were still very powerful. They held a lot of power in this area. And it wasn't like the whites were already suppressing them, even though they were trying to push a little bit. They were still military and trading partners with these nations. And so the French had cultivated this broad network of Indian alliances as early as the 1740s. And in response, the British tried to inflate the power of the Six Nations, the Iroquois Confederacy that dominated much of the Northeast. In particular, they elevated an Ohio Iroquois named Tanagrisson, and treating him as a spokesman for all the Ohio nations. Even though he really wasn't, this is how the French treated him. Now, the British dubbed Tanagrisson, there you go, the Half-King. That's what they called him. He didn't really speak for all the Ohio Indians. He'd come to the scene only in the late 1740s, and his role was never really recognized by the French, who thought him more English than French by his associations. And so in the summer of 1753, the French started acting a bit more brazenly, kind of thumbing their nose. The king already has one, and it's blue. Go away, you small-brained wiper of other people's bottoms, or I shall taunt you again a second time. And most of you should know what that is from. And now, so the French sent 2,600 soldiers into the region, and they built a fort on the shore of Lake Erie, and another at the headwaters of the nearby Le Boeuf Creek. And both the British officials in Virginia and their Indian allies in Ohio didn't really like this. They kind of pissed them off a little bit. And that's when George Washington, walked onto the stage of history. At the end of 1753, Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie, here, I'll show you a picture of Dinwiddie. I do have a picture of Dinwiddie here. It's a great name, by the way. This is Governor Dinwiddie. And this is how these guys looked. It's always nice to put a face to a name. Wearing the powdered wig and a little paunchy. So there's your Governor Dinwiddie. Now, Dinwiddie asked Washington to lead a diplomatic expedition to warn the French to leave their forts. So, we're going to be diplomats, but we're here to warn you to leave your forts. Well, that's obviously going to have an ultimatum with it. And so Washington had been in the militia less than a year at this point. But he'd worked as a surveyor starting at the age of 16. So about, 5-6 years earlier. And the governor knew this experience would help him navigate the frontier as he led the 500-mile trek from Williamsburg in Virginia to Fort Le Boeuf. Now, if you've never been, folks, by the way, if you want to find a great place to visit, go visit Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. And there was one year I was contemplating, do we take our family to Disneyland or Disney World, or do we take them to what's called, not the Golden, it's the something triangle. It's a historical triangle from Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, over to Yorktown, where the surrender of the British to Washington's forces took place, and then down to Jamestown. And so this place is amazing to see if you've never been there. Look up Colonial Williamsburg, and you're going to see some really cool sights there. So this is where Washington left from. He was kind of the working capital, so to speak, of Virginia at that time. So the group reached Fort Le Boeuf on December 11th, 1753, and they were accompanied by Tanagrisson and other Ohio Indians, and the French commandant received the party with great civility. He even sent them home with supplies, but he rebuffed Governor Dinwiddie's demands, who, remember, he's sending the party to diplomatically try to tell them, basically, F off. We want to take this land. Now, still, Washington's journey had allowed him to gather some really valuable intelligence for the British. He'd learned that the French were assembling a flotilla of small boats to carry them to the forks of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers met to form the Ohio River, and where the British planned to build a small but strategic fort. Now, after Washington returned, His journal of the expedition was published in Williamsburg and London, spreading the young officer's fame. His name started to build already at age 22. And so in early 1754, Dinwiddie promoted Washington to second in command of the Virginia Regiment, and he sent him back to the Ohio Valley, and this time to complete the fort at the forks of the Ohio. And although he wasn't instructed to start a war, he had the authority by Dinwiddie to restrain any French interlopers and, if necessary, quote, kill and destroy, end quote, them. Kill and destroy them. So, following the May 28th battle, when French officials learned that Ensign Jumonville had been killed by British colonists and their Indian supporters, and this was when Washington, of course, came out of the rocks up over the ridge and attacked the encampment of the French got pissed. Their anger boiled over, and according to French accounts, Jumonville and his men were preparing to deliver a diplomatic summons to the British, not take up arms against them. And so, in fact, they insisted Jumonville had tried to get the British to stop firing so he could speak to them. He came out and tried to get them to stop fighting. Now remember, this battle only took 15 minutes, but he's out there trying to stop it. One report even claimed that Jumonville had been shot through the head while one of his fellow soldiers was in the process of reading a message to the British. And the French portrayed Washington's ambush as the brutal murder of a diplomatic official. Now, some sources, including a British newspaper, reported that Tenant-Grisson himself had killed Jumonville. One telling of that story, one was the washing of the hands and the brains, but one other telling by a British deserter added an especial brutal twist. As Jumonville lay wounded after the battle, Tenant-Grisson approached him and remarked, "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon Pierre," meaning, "You are not dead yet, my father." And he lifted his tomahawk and planted the blade in Jumonville's skull. And so thus the end of a French officer, ensign, he was an ensign, in the Americas, far from home. So, centuries later, it's still not clear who's to blame for the whole bloody incident. Had the French been planning to attack the British all along? Or had the British opened fire hastily, or been manipulated by their Indian allies? Dinwiddie, for his part in this, the governor, had always blamed his Indian allies. He used them as the scapegoat for starting the whole thing. He told his superiors back in London that this skirmish, this is a quote, by the way, in his letter, "This little skirmish was by the half-king and their Indians. We were as auxiliaries to them," end quote. That's not the case at all. Now, a few years ago, the author of this article that I read in the Smithsonian magazine, you can check it out. His name is, I saw it in here at one point. Just to be fair, I want to say his name was, drum roll please, David Preston wrote this article, and it was called The Trigger. And he was sitting in the sprawling reading room of the British National Archives in Kew. And this enormous bound volume on the table that was sitting there before him was part of a collection called the Colonial Office Papers. Now, this trove of colonial documents included official correspondences, maps, legal and military records, and Indian treaties. Now, the intriguing thing, if you're a historian or love history, sitting there with a huge tome that's full of some of these original documents and copies of these documents is a fascinating thing to go through. So, he said that he was intrigued by the location and date of one document in particular. It was entitled "A Treaty with the Indians at Camp Mount Pleasant," October 18th, 1754. Now, Camp Mount Pleasant was a British outpost along the upper Potomac River in what is now western Maryland. And in the fall of 1754, a group of British Army officers gathered there with Ohio Iroquois, Delaware, and Shawnee leaders to renew their alliance and hear their grievances. And through an interpreter, a British scribe recorded the Indians' speeches word for word with a quill and ink over a total of 10 pages. One speech had been delivered by a man identified as a chief warrior of the Ohio Iroquois. The French had driven the chief warrior and his people from their lands in the Ohio Valley, and they were now living as refugees amongst the British. And the chief warrior began bluntly telling the British officers, "We are all soldiers and warriors. Some sharp words will now pass between us. We shall talk like drunken men." And those sharp words turned into a very extended account of the major events that had brought them to their current crisis. From Washington's 1753 diplomatic mission to the French conquest of the forks of the Ohio River and the Jumonville affair. Now here's this author who has stumbled on this paperwork that's been hidden in plain sight, a new document pertaining to none other than George Washington and the Indian allies who had supported him in this diplomatic mission. How cool is that, first of all? So, this author, he couldn't believe his good fortune at this. He went back to the existing histories, and he confirmed that this October 1754 treaty had never been transcribed. It hadn't been analyzed. It hadn't even been cited by previous scholars writing on Washington and the Jumonville affair. It provided a rare eyewitness account of opening scenes of the French and Indian War. So who was this chief warrior that's mentioned in these documents, in these handwritten notes? The treaty minutes provide no clues, other than that he was known to have a true heart, quote unquote, to the British alliance. So perhaps the speaker was Canucksusi, a Seneca man, whom Washington had once described as a great warrior. Or perhaps it was Silverheels. And by the way, do you recognize that name? I don't know if there is a family relation, but remember the old 1950s and early 60s Lone Ranger television series with Clayton Moore playing the Lone Ranger? It was Jay Silverheels who played Tonto, his Indian ally. Now, I have not looked up to see if there was a connection, but I thought that's very interesting, that name. So there's some speculation that it might have been Silverheels, who went on to one of the most remarkable British military careers of any Indian warrior of the time, fighting with distinction in the Ohio Valley, in New York, in South Carolina, and even on the West Indies island of Martinique. So now, the chief warrior, as it says in these documents, voiced his suspicion that the King of England and the King of France had made an agreement to cut us off, that both European powers were conspiring to divide and conquer the Indians. Oh, how on the mark he was at that time without really knowing it. And as the chief warrior told the British, certain events and revelations had given us some reason to suspect you. The chief warrior then described his own involvement in the Jumonville affair. The young George Washington he described was neither a valiant hero nor a bloodthirsty aggressor. Instead, he was an earnest but headstrong 22-year-old who, simply put, wasn't very good at cultivating allies. And I suppose if you're going to sneak up on them in the woods in their camp at gunpoint, it's not going to cultivate good allies, I would think. So the chief warrior complained that after he and his fellow Ohio Iroquois escorted Washington from their encampment in Logstown to Fort Le Boeuf in 1753, Washington, quote, left us there, came through the woods, and never thought it worth his while to come to Logstown or near us and give us any account of the speeches that passed between him and the French at the fort, which he promised to do. Now Washington had seemed more interested in making his report to Governor Dinwiddie than cultivating Indian allies. Now he had promised to go back to them, and he didn't. He just sighed past them and went all the way back home. So now, the chief warrior had also witnessed the French takeover of Trent's Fort in April 1754. He reported that the now this is where Jumonville and the French were holed up. He reported that the British had surrendered meekly in the face of 600 French Marines and militia, the largest European military force that had yet been seen in the Ohio River Valley. But the chief warrior noted that Tenengrisson, the half-king, had tried to stir up conflict during the surrender, warning the French not to trespass on Ohio Iroquois lands, where he had given permission for the English to build a trading post. Now, Tenengrisson had even pushed a French officer, and a scuffle ensued. I can just see that. He stiff-armed a French officer. French officer's like, "Mon Dieu!" And a little fight broke out. Now, Tenengrisson had pushed this guy, and if cooler heads had not prevailed, the chief warrior told the group they would not have left one Frenchman alive upon the spot. So there was a growing animosity here already. And, of course, the pride of the chief and the pride of the people who were there. They were powerful. Don't push us around, in other words. Don't F with us. We will take you out. And so this telling of the story offers some really important new angles on the origins of the Jumonville affair. It indicates that the French had humiliated Tenengrisson, dealing with him as an English puppet and exposing his lack of influence. After the incident, Tenengrisson's band of 80 to 100 men, women, and children had fled the area, taking refuge with their British allies to the east. Now, Tenengrisson had a vendetta against a particular French officer named Michael Pepin. Now, what's very interesting, Lake Pepin, up on the Mississippi, again, not sure of the ties. I have not found the tie, but the name is the same. Where the small fort of St. Antoine was over here in Wisconsin. So Michael Pepin, also known as La Force, and only a few weeks earlier, La Force had spoken at Tenegrisson's settlement of Logstown, and he threatened his band of Ohio Iroquois that, quote, "You have but a short time to see the sun. For in 20 days you and your brothers, the English, shall all die." This is what Pepin told him. And so by the end of May 1754, when Tenengrisson reported to Washington that a French army was on its way to strike the first English they see, quote-unquote, strike the first English they see, Tenengrisson believed that the French, especially the feared La Force, Pepin, were plotting to kill him and his followers. And so the three parties met amid a perfect storm of misunderstandings. The Ohio Iroquois, that band, believed that they were being pursued by the French. The French considered themselves diplomats. They were delivering a summons to the British to leave French lands, much like the summons Washington had delivered to the French some months earlier. And the British were advancing with the information they'd gathered from Tenengrisson and others, believing the French were coming for them with violent intentions. So here's this perfect storm brewing. And so when it comes to the battle itself, the chief warrior's account surpasses all other eyewitnesses that were there, and all their accounts in its level of tactical detail. In particular, no other account provides as much insight on how the Indian warriors guided the young Washington in his first combat action, which was an ambush. And the Indians directed him to go up the hill, go straight to the French where they were. Don't go above them 50 yards off when they must come in sight of the French camp below them. And while the warriors, and that was a quote, by the way, let me read that again because I didn't read it as a quote. The Indians directed Washington to, quote, go up the hill, straight to the French where they were, not above 50 yards off, when they must come in sight of the French camp below them, end quote. And so while the warriors sent the Virginian toward the rocky precipice, the Indians descended into the hollow. And the half-king with his warriors went to the left to intercept them if they should go that way. And Monocatatha, with another young warrior, Cherokee Jack, went to the right. That's from the account as well. So one line from Chief Warrior's speech really stuck out above all others. He said this. He said, Colonel Washington began himself and fired, and then his people. Colonel Washington began himself and fired, and then his people. Washington himself always took responsibility for ordering his company to open fire. But the chief warrior's reports takes this event even further, claiming that Washington literally fired the first shot. Hang on, folks. I got to close my studio door because I hear all kinds of noise out there. Sorry for that little interruption of reality. So the Chief Warrior's report takes this even further. He claimed that Washington literally fired the first shot. And perhaps it was Washington's signal to his soldiers and his Indian allies to commence the attack, or perhaps he was taking aim at a French adversary. Either way, if true, this heightens Washington's moral responsibility in the whole affair. Now, the Chief Warrior contended that French traded volleys with the English. 2 or 3 fires. Thank you. Sorry about that. Interruptions. The Chief Warrior contended that the French traded volleys with the English, 2 or 3 fires, as many pieces as would go off, being rainy weather, and the French, having taken to their heels and running, happened to run the way of the half-king, was with his warriors. 8 of them met with the destiny by the Indian tomahawks. And the stunned French survivors fled back in the opposite direction, only to run headlong into Monocatatha and Cherokee Jack, who presented the prisoners to Washington, adding that we had blooded the edge of his hatchet a little, just a little. And so one Frenchman named Monceau managed to slip into the woods and spread news of the skirmish, and the rest were now prisoners. And the Chief Warrior revealed that Washington failed to report about one of his casualties, that the Virginians unluckily shot their own man who had gotten ahead of their lines in the chaos of battle. And so this is the account as was given to us. And there's a lot of more information to give, but we're out of time. And on July 3rd of 1754, Fort Necessity, the little round fort I showed you, as it was called, was attacked by a group of 600 Frenchmen and about 100 of their Indian allies seeking vengeance, and the group's commander, Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, was Jumonville's older brother. Washington's side suffered severe casualties, and the British accepted French terms for an honorable surrender of the post. So here you see how George Washington really became the man, whatever his action was, who precipitated the beginning of the French and Indian War. And I gotta quit there, folks. We are out of time. So thank you for being here tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow night. Sorry for the abrupt ending. Maybe we'll pick this up a little bit because there's a lot more to it. So I hope you had fun with a little bit of history. Talk to you later. Good night.